James.
Today we celebrate something that didn't happen. The annual general meeting of the 10th largest company in Britain, that's Cavenham Limited, run by Sir James Goldsmith, should have been held in London today, but it wasn't. Because a few months ago, Jimmy Goldsmith lost interest in running a British public company for his shareholders, so he persuaded them to sell it to the French. Or rather, to a French company controlled by himself. For Jimmy Goldsmith, it was just another controversial chapter in a colourful life. And with Eton, the guards and a few influential friends to help him, well, how could it be anything else? Goldsmith, of course, today is a very rich man with a knighthood. And while most of the business buccaneers of the 60s have crashed around him, he goes from strength to strength. John Roberts reports from inside the company that keeps Jimmy Goldsmith, Cavenham Limited.
You'll never see the name Cavenham on any food it makes. A jar of Marmite gives no clue to Cavenham. The label says it's made by Marmite Limited. A jar of Bovril doesn't mention Cavenham, nor does a tin of Ambrosia creamed rice. Famous name liqueur chocolates are from Carson's of Bristol, apparently. Yet they are all just part of Cavenham Limited. Its lorries say UKD. In Britain's high streets, Cavenham trades behind shop fronts which say Lipton's or Presto. To the American shopper, they're Grand Union. Today, Cavenham is even bigger abroad than in Britain. It has other famous names in other countries. It's behind some of the best-known brands in France, Sweden and Spain. It's taken Cavenham only 13 years to become the third largest food company in Europe. It began in Britain with a takeover. Procia was a small company which made the essential ingredients for a special kind of bread. Its factory on the Slough bypass in Berkshire had a somewhat melancholy history. In these huts were once stored the belongings of wartime airmen who had been reported lost or missing in action. In this now abandoned factory, Procia was run by two research scientists. They were devoted to improving the nutritional value of bread. The young Jimmy Goldsmith took over Procia and formed Cavenham in 1964. Into Cavenham he put Carr's Biscuits and a string of little sweet companies which were losing money. In those days, Goldsmith could afford only companies which were doing badly and going cheap. His plan was to spot companies with potential, put in better managers, and build up brand names. First, he needed a financial backer. Roland Franklin was then with a small bank, Keyser Ullman.
I think it was our backing for him was based primarily on a belief in the concept of what he was doing. I had quite fortuitously acquired some knowledge of the confectionery trade, and what he was aiming to do chimed in very much with what I knew or thought I knew ought to be done. So there was no difficulty in convincing us that his concept was a valid concept.
Goldsmith got Jack Greenhalgh, a marketing man from Procter & Gamble, to become head of Procia.
I met him in an interview that lasted only a few minutes. In fact, I felt he was just about the most dynamic, most intelligent person I'd ever met. And I thought he was going to be a great success. I wanted to be a part of it. I also thought it was going to be a lot of fun.
It was quite clear to me that...
Brian Calloway was from the pet foods division of Mars. He was interviewed for the job of production director.
Within the course of the interview, obviously, we went into the factory, and I mean, it was horrifying by pet foods standards. The place was really run down, lack of equipment, etc., etc. But of course, the attraction to me was that it could only go one way, which was upwards, and maybe I could go with it.
But it didn't go upwards. At first, it went downwards. Today, only 2 of the original 9 sweet factories survive. In spite of reorganisation, increased production and cost-saving devices like leaving the string tails off the white mice, the confectionery companies went on losing money. That didn't leave much room for other mistakes. By 1967, barely 2 years after it had been put together from a hodgepodge of run-down companies, Cavenham was in real trouble. The mistake Jimmy Goldsmith had made was to go into wholesaling, something which Cavenham proved quite unable to do well. He'd bought a 20% share stake in a company called Singleton & Cole, and then there followed a long and bitter takeover battle to get full control. Ironically, what he won so hard proved to be a millstone round Cavenham's neck. The accounts to the end of the year 1967 showed that Cavenham had lost a large chunk of its shareholders' money and had been on the brink of insolvency. So what did Goldsmith do then to get out of that? Let's have a look at the deal he did then, which probably saved Cavenham. Inside this disaster called Singleton & Coal, he found one real gem. Of all things, it was a snuff company, Illingworth of Kendal. So he got together with America's largest snuff manufacturer, Conwood, and they set up a joint company in Switzerland. Cavenham put in its snuff business. The Americans arranged a £1 million loan to the Swiss company, and then the two partners agreed on a high valuation for this snuff business they now jointly owned. That high valuation enabled Goldsmith to show a capital profit on what he'd originally paid. And he put that capital profit not in the balance sheet where it belonged, but in the profit and loss account. Even that wasn't enough to save Cavenham from showing a loss. So he also put into the profit and loss account a gift. Goldsmith and the French baron, Alexis de Gunsberg, gave Cavenham £500,000. And after that, its fortunes began to improve. The first breakthrough came when Cavenham's men discovered in Procier's laboratories a formula for a slimming bread. They exploited it in a way the Procier old guard wouldn't have dreamt of. It was called Slimcia. The attraction of making slimming bread is that you give people less of it than ordinary bread, but you charge more for such a special product. So they launched Slimcia by advertising it on television as a brand.
Slim and fit. To keep slim and fit, be careful to diet properly. Try Slimcia. It's high in protein for fitness and lowest in calories per slice of any
The Cavenham marketing men followed the Goldsmith plan. Sell by brand name and don't let the customer forget it. A classic marketing strategy.
controlled diet. Slimcia helps keep you slim and fit.
Success came next where Goldsmith had never planned it. One of Cavenham's takeovers landed them with a string of tobacconist shops. They made a success of them, so they built up a chain called R.S. McColl. For the first time, Goldsmith discovered he might make more money out of selling things than making them. R.S. McColl and Slimcia are no longer with Cavenham. They were successful. They were sold to raise money. That's the way Jimmy Goldsmith does business. Confectionery is still part of Cavenham. It's the part of the Goldsmith plan that has failed. These chocolate mice and rainbow drops are doing fine. Pocket money is not subject to the government's pay guidelines. Chewits, a modest, not a monster success. Less goo, puffed up to the same size as rival opal fruits, sold for 2p less.
Chewits, even chewier than a 15-story block of flats.
But Elizabeth Shaw's mint crisps are a small affair still. And as for famous names, these days fewer and fewer people can afford the luxury of liqueur chocolates. Soon, however, confectionery was to become only a small part of a much bigger Cavenham. The next phase of the Jimmy Goldsmith story started around 1971. By now, Cavenham had pulled away from the brink of insolvency, and although it had shown losses more often than profits in the last 5 years, Goldsmith could show that Cavenham was growing fast in both profits and dividends. Now he used his creative financial flair for all it was worth. He took over companies and sold off bits of them, to dramatic effect. This was the heyday of the asset stripper and the takeover battle. Others made bigger bids. Others made more profitable bids. But no one moved as fast as Jimmy Goldsmith from a quite small base to being one of the 30 shares quoted in the Financial Times Index. In the first 5 years of its life, Cavenham had turned a small group of struggling companies into a profitable business. But Cavenham was small and relatively unknown. The big thrust came in 1971. The key to it all was a rising share price and a share that people could be persuaded to accept. so new shares could be offered instead of cash when buying other companies. Another way to avoid paying cash was the issue of loan stock. That's a promise to pay interest now and the full amount later. Sir James's skill shows itself in the way he uses a small amount of cash to maximum advantage. The first company that Cavenham absorbed was the old established firm of Bovril, larger than Cavenham. It had 3 important national brands, Bovril, Ambrosia and Marmite. The total cost of Bovril was over £18 million. Cavenham paid only £4.9 million in cash. The rest was paid for with Cavenham shares and loan stock. The Bovril takeover was only possible because one really big investor had a few months earlier put the stamp of approval on Cavenham shares.
The impression which he gave overall was a man who, despite perhaps the reputation which he had acquired in his youth, of being a very serious person, very much in charge of the operation, having, say, provided himself with adequate management to make a start on this program of his. And in the position of the company and the market share at the time, it seemed that this was a reasonable thing to back.
This pushed Cavenham shares up further. Now they were worth nearly £2. They could be used to buy another company. Moore's Wrights was a biscuit manufacturer and a chain of shops. It was almost broke, but Goldsmith bought it, and this gave Cavenham its first big retail chain. It cost more than £8 million, £1 million in cash, £7 million in Cavenham stock. Cavenham's share price soared again. Goldsmith got ready to do it once more, to issue more shares and buy another company many times larger than Cavenham. Allied Suppliers was a huge chain of retail shops trading under many names. Cavenham paid £90 million for Allied Suppliers, but less than a quarter, £22 million of that, was paid in cash. To pull off his biggest ever deal, Sir James had to win over Unilever. They held a big block of Allied shares.
Well, there were 2 aspects of it that were complicated. The first was that we had a controlling situation through some rather unusual voting shares in Allied Suppliers. We had to ensure that if we did a deal involving the sale of those shares, that the outside shareholders, the public shareholder, got properly and fairly treated. We wanted a fair price for our own shares, but the most complicated aspect of all was that we wanted a very integral and important part of Allied Suppliers for ourselves, and that was the Lipton tea business, a worldwide tea business. We needed that because we have a very successful tea business in the States, and we wanted that business. Now, from Jimmy's point of view, I mean, not only was it complicated, but it was big. In one swoop, when that deal was consummated, Jimmy roughly doubled the size of his company.
There were other acquisitions that year, including some French food interests. In all, Cavenham spent just over £40 million in cash. It had become, in a matter of a few months, the second largest retailer in the country. But a lot of this money was borrowed. As Cavenham took over more companies, it could borrow on the strength of their assets. Cavenham didn't remain a big debtor for long. In no time at all, it was raising more cash. Out went a half share in the profitable R.S. McColl chain. Out went the Bovril dairy operation, not vital to the rest of the business and a good way of raising money. The kitty was growing. Out went a half share in the newly acquired Moore's chain. Out goes the old stager, Carr's Biscuits, joined with newly acquired rights. Out go the Lipton tea interests, a rich asset buried in the ramshackle stores group. Already, nearly enough cash has been raised to finance the year's buying spree. But the cash build-up went on. Cavenham's string of purchases yielded acres of properties it didn't need. Soon they were going on to the market, stores that were no longer wanted, Allied's valuable old headquarters in central London. Cash raised soon exceeded cash spent. Even after all this buying, Cavenham was left with cash in hand. It could buy more if it wanted to. As a result of all these purchases, Cavenham was now a major British company, 10 times bigger than the rather unspectacular company it had been just a few months earlier. In spite of its surge in growth, Cavenham was still operating out of its original head office at the old Procia works in Slough. Sir James Goldsmith doesn't visit his factories much. He's become the financier. He leaves his managers to sort out the brands in the companies he buys. The strong national brands, shop names or products, are kept and improved. The others are scrapped or sold. The treatment began with Bovril. The dairy operations had to go. Large bulk, low profits are not part of the Goldsmith style. The loss-making interests in Argentina had been a millstone round the old company's neck. They were sold. Bovril's factories were well equipped. The company had strong brand names, but was letting one die. At Bovril's Ambrosia Creamery, the old management had cut out advertising. Cavenham relaunched the Ambrosia brands, not a moment too soon. Today, Ambrosia is again a market leader, but its three strong competitors are tested and watched very closely.
Thin, black body, colour quite good.
This one,
We must do an analysis on this one. Very creamy. This is distinctly chewy.
While in 1972 Cavenham paused from takeover in Britain, abroad its spate of acquisitions went on. And abroad, exactly the same plan is sprung into action when a new takeover is complete. This is Amora. 2/3 of France's mustard is made under this brand name. It's part of a French group called General Alimentaire. When Cavenham took over General Alimentaire, it had exactly the same problems as Bovril.
The company, for a time, was more dynamic than prudent and became involved in a number of other activities, some of them, in fact, nothing to do with food, which were very costly failures.
So General Alimentaire subsidiaries got the Cavenham treatment. Tight financial controls were introduced. Unrelated bits of the companies were sold off. But France is much more important to Cavenham than that. Cavenham is controlled from France. Sir James Goldsmith has for 20 years pursued two parallel business careers. One in Britain, one over here. And just as he was building up, in England, a food empire, so in France he was building up financial muscle, and more important, the financial nerve centre to control it. Just as in Britain, he had to start off by taking over such companies as he could afford, so in France, he started off by taking over what in financial parlance are termed shell companies. Shell companies have lost their original business. They're shadows of their former selves, but they still have shareholders. And the shell companies, which Sir James Goldsmith took over in France, were a really rum lot. In France, as in Britain, he found a small bank to help buy these shells. There was a company which had run tramways in Algeria until they were nationalised. It also owned a Parisian publishing company. But Goldsmith's interest in publishing wasn't so strong in those days. It was sold. There was also a firm whose only surviving asset was an annual trainload of coal from Poland. He acquired interests in companies which used to deliver ice to Parisian homes. Just as he was negotiating to buy Allied suppliers in Britain, Sir James bought and sold a quarter share in the Eiffel Tower Company. What he didn't want was sold for cash. Union des Assurances de Paris was the big French investor whose support he won. It's the French equivalent of the Prudential. Both now hold shares in his French master company. Its name is Générale Occidentale. It's never been in the public eye as much as Cavenham has, and although today Générale Occidentale controls a large international empire and owns the whole of Cavenham, it's still a comparatively obscure company. There's no imposing head office. Its nerve centre is tucked away in a suite of offices in the bank it operates here in an office block along the Champs-Élysées. That's where the ultimate decisions are made. The control centre of the Goldsmith Empire is presided over by the most remarkable of his associates. She came to him with one of the companies he bought, Madame Gilbert Beau. She steers the group through complex deals, like the selling of Bovril's stake in Argentina.
I am a banker, as you know. I have 31st, it's my 31st year in banking, and so I'm a banker. I'm a budget banker particularly. I like to negotiate, and it takes a large part of my time.
Under her guidance, Banque Occidentale manages the buying and selling of companies. It orchestrates the constant reshuffling of the group's financial structure.
In our group, it is clear that we have here more the merchant banking activities or the corporate finance development of the group. And in terms of of number of people and of time spent on business, it is quite clear that the mergers, the acquisitions, the selling of what we don't want in a group we buy, all that is more done by Paris. And we don't pretend to manage a plant, for instance, or to be really industrial persons.
The Goldsmith Empire manages to be French to the French, British to the British. From here, its affairs are so arranged that the group pays the minimum of tax in every country in which it operates. But although control is from France, Cavenham is a manifestation today of the original Goldsmith concept of an international food company. Cavenham's explosive 13-year growth may have made it well known to the business world, but it's a name which means little to the ordinary shopper. That's the consequence of Goldsmith's style. Cavenham doesn't lavish money on its appearance. It doesn't build imposing new factories. It patches up old ones. The other reason why it's not well known is that all Cavenham's buying and selling of companies leaves a certain confusion about its real activities. It has also grown to its present size without introducing a single major new product. It's not an originator or inventor. It's an improver of other people's work. Today, Cavenham's biggest new product development is the Bovril Cube. The Bovril Cube is, as its very name suggests, a splendid accolade to someone else's traditional product. Cavenham executives make no apologies. They see themselves as operators of an efficiency machine.
If we get to the stage where a company can no longer be improved further by us, but could be improved further by somebody else, for the good of the people in that company, the brands and all the work it implies, then we would pass that company over to somebody else. And these are the only occasions on which we have sold a company where we could not improve them, but somebody else could do better.
And if you look at the food industry, there have been very few what are truly original products in the last 25 years. In fact, I have difficulty thinking beyond instant coffee. All the rest are variations on a theme which has been around for a very long time. Therefore, I have no conscience about the possible suggestion that we're followers, not leaders, because I think it's perfectly true to a high degree. We are following, but we're following with better products than were there before. And I don't think we're necessarily in business to be the leaders in any particular product range, etc., etc.
Almost exactly 2 years ago, Sir James Goldsmith was asked by the Bank of England to salvage the group built up by the most famous of his peers, Jim Slater. The two are friends. They have much in common. Both got to the top by buying and selling companies, using their shares as paper money. But Slater and other whiz kids crashed. They had invested in paper empires. Goldsmith survived because he bought real assets. His companies make or sell things that everybody has to buy. Inflation ruined others. It helped him. The borrowings he had incurred to expand with became easier to repay as inflation put more and more money into his tills. Other firms faltered in the British recession. Cavenham's spread of worldwide operations ensured its survival. While achieving all this, Sir James has incurred mounting criticism. An executive meeting at Cavenham's new headquarters. There was to have been an annual general meeting today, but Sir James has now bought out his British shareholders. The way he went about it caused bitter controversy. Has he used shareholders' money to pursue his own ends? Has he broken his word? Has he, as some say, been guilty of financial sleight of hand? Next week, we'll be asking Sir James these questions and talking about the way he runs his business.